By the time the street lights flickered on, the new Jeeps gleamed under the amber glow like silent sentinels. Each one was parked with precision, perfectly aligned with the curb. Dylan stood at his bedroom window, staring out through a narrow gap in the curtain. He didn't recognize any of the vehicles. He didn't have to. This wasn't coincidence. It was a message. Downstairs, Mark spoke quietly on the phone. His voice was low, steady, deliberate. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Across the street, Karen's porch light remained off, her curtains stiff and unmoving. For someone who prided herself on noticing everything, she hadn't stepped outside once all day. Dylan suspected. She was still watching, but not from the window anymore. There was something more careful now, like a predator waiting for the next move. Later that night, the neighborhood group chat buzzed. Are these cars allowed? Who owns the red one? Is there a car show going on? HOA should say something. No reply came from the HOA's usual voice. And that voice was always Karen's. Always the first to post, to remind, to correct. Tonight's silent. Mark walked the perimeter of the house, locking doors, checking lights, standing just long enough on the porch to be seen if anyone was watching. He didn't care who read his stillness. He wanted it read. Dylan stepped out behind him. You think she'll report them? She's deciding how, Mark said. But she will. What if they're not even from around here? Mark didn't answer that night. Dreams didn't come easy. Dylan kept waking up. Sure, he'd heard the gravel crunch outside. Sure, someone had been near the Jeep in the garage. When he finally dozed off, it was near dawn. And when he woke again, he found another envelope, but not on the Jeep dot. It was taped to the front door. This time, it wasn't an official notice. It was handwritten, but with the same condescending tone that now felt familiar. Multiple violations. Disruptive vehicles. Please address before escalation. HOA. Still no signature dot, still no rule-cited dot, still no contact from anyone, but the whisper of paper and the silence of threats. Mark read it twice, folded it neatly, set it in a drawer. He didn't seem angry, just more resolved. Dylan asked, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing yet," Mark replied, but his eyes didn't match his words. Later that morning, he drove Dylan to school himself. Not in the Jeep, but in his usual SUV. The Jeep stayed locked in the garage. When they pulled out of the neighborhood, Dylan caught sight of Karen's mailbox. Someone had jammed it open. A white slip fluttered just slightly, barely held in place. Dylan looked at his dad, who didn't speak. Was that Dylan began? Mark only smiled. It's starting, he said. Now let's see who really follows the rules. They disappeared onto the main road, leaving Birchwood Lane quieter than it had been in years. But behind them, a slow storm had started to gather, built not from thunder or wind, but from pride, silence, and carefully chosen timing. And across the street, Karen finally opened her curtain, but the world she looked out at was no longer one she recognized. The air on Birchwood Lane had grown cautious. People walked their dogs with quicker steps. Side glances replaced greetings. Conversations, once casual, had become clipped, often muttered and interrupted by long silences. It wasn't just the Jeeps. It was the shift in weight, the sense that someone had tipped the balance in a place obsessed with keeping it centered. Karen wasn't seen outside all weekend. Her lawn, once maintained to the inch, began to lose its razor-sharp edges. Her roses sagged. The trash bins weren't wheeled in as promptly. Neighbors took notice, but no one knocked. They knew Karen's pride would never allow her to admit. Something was off inside. Karen paced. She hadn't expected retaliation, and certainly not from the Harpers. They were always quiet, respectful, boring even. The son had just graduated, and Mark rarely attended any HOA meetings. She assumed he didn't care about governance, and that made him safe. Now, she wasn't sure. She dialed up Sandra and Everett, two board members who usually echoed her views. Without much resistance, they met at her kitchen table later that afternoon, careful to park in her garage so their presence wouldn't be noticed. "They're baiting you," Sandra said, sipping her tea. "They're baiting the board," Karen corrected. "It's not personal." Everett raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Because 3 Jeeps showed up after your complaint." "I'd call that personal." Karen stood by the window, peeking through the blinds. The red one was still parked directly across from her home. Its polished hood pointed like a challenge. "It's a pattern," she said, as if repeating it enough would make it official. "Disruption. Disregard. They're breaking uniformity." Sandra sighed. "We can't enforce rules that aren't in the handbook. They're using that against us," Karen said. "They know we've been lax on enforcement. Now they're calling us out." Everett leaned forward. "Unless you have something solid, we need to tread carefully. We can't afford another audit." Karen stiffened. "We can create a motion. Emergency aesthetics enforcement. All non-standard vehicles must be screened or removed. It's within the board's discretion if it impacts neighborhood appeal." Sandra frowned. "That clause hasn't been used in 6 years. "Then we'll be the first to use it in 6 years," Karen snapped. The meeting ended with no formal decision, but the seeds were planted. That night, an internal HOA memo was quietly drafted and circulated. No one else in the neighborhood saw it, not yet. But the intent was clear. Compliance was being redefined and only a few were in on the change. Meanwhile, across the street, Dylan sat on the roof of the garage, legs dangling over the edge as he watched a tow truck drive slowly past the cul-de-sac before continuing without stopping. He held a camera in his hands, the kind used by auto appraisers. Mark opened the garage below him, stood for a long minute in front of the Jeep, then stepped back and took photos of it from every angle. He measured distances from the curb. He checked for oil leaks. There were none. Later that evening, Mark placed a large envelope in the mailbox addressed to Birchwood HOA legal office. He walked away without looking back. That same night, another neighbor received a notice, this time for an overgrown decorative bush that had been trimmed the same way for 5 years. And the next day, one of the Jeeps vanished, but not the one in front of Karen's house. That one remained defiantly unmoved. Karen woke to find a note slipped into her own mailbox, typed clean. No name. It read, "If you're playing a game, know that some people play for keeps." Karen stood in her driveway, arms crossed, scanning the street as if the note in her mailbox had left a visible residue. Nothing moved. Birds chirped like any other morning. The distant sound of sprinklers clicked on. The only thing that seemed out of place was her own breath, sharp, uneven. She'd reread the note 4 times. Not a smudge on the paper. No watermark. No envelope. Just that one sentence, folded with a precision that hinted at calculation. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't a prank. It was a warning, and that made it worse. Inside, she pulled the blinds down tight. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Calling the police would sound paranoid. And what would she even say? That someone wrote her a grammatically correct sentence across the street. The red Jeep sat unmoved. Dylan hadn't touched it in 2 days. That made her nervous. The silence felt deliberate. Later that afternoon, an unexpected email landed in the HOA inbox. It wasn't from a resident, it came from a law office, one Karen didn't recognize. The subject line was cold. Request for documentation. Enforcement justification. Birchwood HOA. Attached were scanned copies of the Jeep violation notice, including photographs of other non-compliant vehicles on nearby streets, all with notes indicating no violations had been issued to them. A subtle implication woven through the words, unequal enforcement. Sandra called Karen in a panic. "What is this?" she asked. "Are we being sued?" Karen flipped through the attachment again. "It's just a request." "But from a lawyer." Karen didn't reply. She stared at the pictures. One of them was a direct photo of her own driveway, taken months earlier when her son had parked his motorcycle in front for a week. No violation had been written then. She hadn't expected anyone to remember. "They're building a case," Sandra whispered. Karen's voice was flat. "No, they're building a spectacle." Down the street, a small white sedan pulled into the Harper driveway. A man in a shirt and tie stepped out holding a portfolio. Mark met him with a handshake. They spoke in low tones, nodding toward the Jeep. The man opened the rear hatch of his car and pulled out a clipboard, followed by a folder labeled Valuation Report. Karen watched from her upstairs hallway. She pulled out her phone and took photos of them, zooming in past the bushes. Then, unsure why, she deleted them just as quickly. She didn't notice Dylan walking down the sidewalk until he turned abruptly and stared directly up at her window. She froze. For just a moment, their eyes met, and she realized he knew she'd been watching. That night, a new message appeared in her mailbox. This time, it was handwritten. "You started with a ticket. What happens next will come in pages." Not slips. No signature. No date. The handwriting was too neat to belong to a teenager. Too deliberate to be dismissed. Karen didn't sleep. Every creak of the floor felt like footsteps. Every engine outside seemed like someone preparing to deliver another reminder that her world was becoming smaller. The next morning, the HOA office received another letter, this time from a community council member who had been anonymously sent a package detailing Birchwood's citation inconsistencies and reports of favoritism. And the package had included a list of properties marked as untouchable. At the top of the list, Karen's address. When she walked outside later that afternoon, she realized something unsettling. Her roses, once bright, proud, and trimmed to perfection, had withered almost overnight. And yet, no one had touched them. The air had simply changed. By midweek, Birchwood Lane felt like a painting that had been scratched at the edges, still recognizable, but visibly altered. The red Jeep remained in place, the grass beneath its tires pressed but unbroken. Most neighbors no longer spoke when passing each other. Some simply nodded. Others turned away altogether. Inside the Harper house, a stack of paperwork covered the dining table. Mark moved slowly through it. Property codes, HOA bylaws, enforcement logs he had requested under the state's open records provisions. Dylan sat nearby, flipping through a smaller folder containing printouts of HOA meeting minutes. "They skipped 3 vote records in August," Dylan said, pointing to a gap in the log. "All marked as informal consensus." "That's not even a thing, right?" Mark didn't answer. He tapped the table twice and circled a line with a red pen. Then he slid a single sheet aside and revealed a photo beneath it. Karen, at the HOA podium. Behind her, a board vote sign-in sheet. Only 2 names visible. 3 decisions had been made that day, none of them legally binding. That afternoon, a new vehicle appeared on Birchwood Lane. A flatbed trailer pulled in behind the Harper driveway. No one recognized the driver. No one saw who ordered it. But it carried a wrapped Jeep, shiny and untouched, identical to Dylan's, except in deep forest green. It was unloaded without a word and parked across the street from Karen's house. Nose to nose with the red one. Karen saw it from her upstairs hallway. Her hand tightened around her phone. She started dialing the HOA emergency line, but hesitated. They hadn't returned her last two messages. The line rang, then stopped. No answer. Inside the board's digital dashboard, access had changed. She couldn't open the admin panel. The permissions were gone. When she called Everett, he said they were rebalancing leadership roles. When she asked what that meant, he said it was just temporary, nothing to worry about. But she could hear it in his voice. He'd grown cautious, afraid. Not of her. Down the street, Dylan walked past her house. Not fast, not slow. Deliberate. Later that night, the Harper's garage door opened again. But this time, Dylan wasn't alone. 3 men in slacks and button-down shirts stood in the driveway, clipboards in hand. One held a binder stamped with the logo of the State Department of Housing Review. Karen stood in her own darkened living room, watching the lights across the street. Then came the knock. She opened the door expecting another envelope. Instead, a teenager stood there, holding a tablet. "You're Karen McIntyre." "Yes," she replied warily. "I'm here on behalf of the Birchwood Resident Audit Committee. We're conducting a door-to-door survey regarding potential abuse of position within the HOA. It's optional, but refusal will be noted." "Who formed this committee?" "The community did," the boy answered. 2/3 vote. "You were absent." "I wasn't notified," she said. "You were," he replied. "Certified letter. Delivered Monday." He held up the tablet. "Would you like to answer the questions?" She didn't respond. Her hand hovered near the door, but she couldn't bring herself to close it. "It'll only take 5 minutes," the boy said, "unless you want your silence to speak for you." She took a slow breath, then stepped outside. The door clicked behind her with a sound too final for comfort. Karen stood in the driveway, hands clasped loosely, as the teenager adjusted the brightness on his tablet. He didn't seem nervous. In fact, he was disturbingly neutral, like he'd done this all week. "First question," he said without hesitation. "Have you ever initiated or influenced an HOA violation against a property without following the formal procedure outlined in Section 4.2? Karen swallowed. I've reported concerns to the board, not the question." The boy replied calmly. "Please answer yes or no." She hesitated. "Yes," she admitted. He nodded and tapped the screen. "Next question. Did you disclose any personal grievances or conflicts of interest related to those reports?" "No." Tap. "Did you receive or expect any personal gain, financial or otherwise, from the outcome of those reports?" She almost laughed at the absurdity, but the boy's expression remained blank. The laughter caught in her throat. "No," she said. "Thank you." He paused, reading the screen silently for a moment. "Last question. Are you aware that under municipal code, misuse of HOA authority may result in fines, board removal, and civil liability if evidence of selective enforcement or misconduct is proven?" Her mouth went dry. "This is a witch hunt." He didn't reply. "Where are these questions coming from?" She snapped. "The bylaws you helped write," he said, then tapped the final box. "You'll be notified if a formal hearing is scheduled. Have a good evening." He turned without waiting for a response, walking to the next house as if this were just another task on a checklist. Karen stood there alone for a long time. Inside the Harper house, Dylan watched the interaction through binoculars. He handed them to his father. 3 neighbors recorded their interviews, Dylan said. "We're up to 17. Mark nodded. "The footage goes to the attorney Monday." At the table, the binder lay open. On its last page was a printed screenshot of the HOA's internal draft for a vehicle aesthetics policy. Karen's name was at the top. The proposal had been typed before Dylan's Jeep ever arrived, so the complaint wasn't reactive. It was premeditated. That night, Dylan took the red Jeep for a drive around the block. The moment he turned the corner, Karen rushed outside and began taking photos of the empty driveway. 5 minutes later, he returned and parked in the exact same spot. He never looked her way. The following morning, every mailbox on Birchwood Lane held a new flyer printed on crisp white cardstock. Community Forum, HOA Fairness, and Transparency hosted by Birchwood Resident Audit Committee Special Guest, Municipal. Compliance Officer City Council District 3 Location, Public Library Auditorium. Thursday at 6 o'clock p.m. Karen read it twice. There was no official HOA logo, no seal. But the message was unmistakable. She stormed to Everett's door before lunch. He answered slowly, looking exhausted. "We're not part of this," he said before she could speak. "You're the board." She hissed. "Not anymore. Not officially. They voted to dissolve it last night." "You can't just dissolve a board." "They can," he said. "When 2/3 of residents sign for reform. It's in the charter. You pushed too hard, Karen." They pushed back. She stood stunned. "Who's even behind this?" asked. "Your neighbor," he muttered. "You thought he sold cars. You never asked what else he does." He closed the door gently. That evening, the green Jeep across from her house vanished, replaced by a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. It idled longer than necessary. A window rolled down. A camera flashed once. Then it drove away. Thursday arrived, with a sky that threatened rain but never followed through. The clouds hung low, as if even the weather were watching. Birchwood Lane was unusually quiet. Not the typical quiet of weekday routine, but something more measured, anticipatory. No lawnmowers, no garage doors, no idle chatter. At exactly 5:45 p.m., Mark and Dylan left their driveway dressed in pressed shirts, holding folders under one arm. They didn't speak as they got into the Jeep. The red one. The one that had started it all. It had been freshly washed, tires gleaming, the engine smooth as it pulled away. Across the street, Karen watched from her front room. She had considered attending the forum. She even set aside a folder of notes, a timeline of the events, receipts, and printouts of rules she thought would help defend her. But something had shifted. The way Everett had looked at her, the silence in the HOA inbox, the dissolving of the board. She hadn't thought it was possible, not like this. By the time the Harpers arrived at the library, more than 50 chairs had been arranged in tight rows. Residents filled them quickly. Some stood along the walls. At the front, a city council liaison sat beside a compliance officer and a moderator from the resident committee. A large screen displayed photographs of the Jeep. Then photos of Karen's prior complaints. Then ones of various other vehicles, some older, more unsightly, none of which had been cited. Mark didn't speak first. It was Dylan. He stood calmly, reading from a statement that laid out each violation, each inconsistency, and the timeline of actions taken against their home. Then he showed the survey results anonymously collected, revealing that nearly half the residents believed their properties had been targeted unfairly or inconsistently over the past 2 years. He wasn't angry. He was exact. Karen, watching through the live stream on her laptop, felt the slow press of something in her chest she didn't want to name. Not guilt, not yet, but something just beneath it. Then came the moment she hadn't expected. Mark stood with a copy of the original HOA charter, the one signed when the community was first formed. He pointed to a clause on page 14. Any board found to be operating outside the bounds of its charter, particularly with unratified motions or concealed enforcement tactics, may be suspended by community vote pending third-party oversight. Then he held up the signed petition, 37 names. The room stayed quiet. The moderator looked toward the city officer, who simply nodded. The HOA board of Birchwood Lane is now under review, he said, effective immediately. All previous citations issued in the last 60 days are suspended. Back at her window, Karen turned off the screen. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen. Later that night, another vehicle pulled up to the Harper home. Not a Jeep, a delivery van. 2 workers stepped out and began unloading a flat stack of signage. Within the hour, new signs appeared at both entrances of Birchwood Lane, community under restructuring. Resident-led governance in progress. Next morning, Karen received an envelope on her porch. No stamp, no address, just her name, typed neatly on the front. She opened it slowly. Inside were 2 things, a blank HOA violation form and a typed note. This is what it feels like. No threats, no demands. Just the form. And silence. The envelope stayed on Karen's table all day. She didn't touch it again, but she didn't throw it away either. It sat beside a half-empty cup of tea that had long gone cold. Outside, the rhythm of Birchwood Lane had changed. Kids rode bikes on the sidewalks again. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to talk in hushed tones. Something had cracked, and the neighborhood was learning how to breathe through it. Karen, for the first time in years, had nothing to do. No HOA minutes to revise, no policy drafts to polish, no meetings to dominate. The inbox password no longer worked. The admin dashboard no longer accepted her login. The silence wasn't peace. It was consequence. Down the street, Dylan was repainting the trim on the mailbox. Not his job, not assigned by anyone, just something he'd noticed needed doing. Others had begun similar tasks, reseeding patches of grass, replacing cracked path lights. There were no inspection reports, no warnings. Just effort. Mark watched from his porch, a clipboard beside him, a legal pad filled with meeting notes from the recent forum. He had been nominated unofficially for a leadership role in the restructured resident council. He hadn't accepted. Not yet. He didn't want power. He wanted memory. At dusk, Karen ventured out for the first time in days. She walked slowly, unsure what to expect. No one yelled. No one pointed. A few people nodded. Some didn't look at all. She passed the Harper's home, but didn't stop. The red Jeep was gone. In its place, the black SUV had returned, but this time, its windows were down. Dylan sat behind the wheel, cleaning the interior with a brush. Karen hesitated. "You really own the dealership?" she asked from the sidewalk, unsure why the words escaped her mouth. Dylan didn't look up immediately. "My dad does," he said, "but I've worked there since I was 14. Karen took a slow breath. I assumed it was just parked to cause trouble." Dylan nodded. "I know." He didn't sound bitter, just tired. "Why did you push it so far?" she asked. He shrugged. "You turned a gift into a weapon. You made me feel like I did something wrong just for parking at home." Karen looked at the sidewalk. "That wasn't my intention. It never is," Dylan replied. "But when you write rules to control people, don't be surprised when they start reading between the lines." She said nothing. The words stung more than she expected. Later that evening, she found another envelope in her mailbox. This one wasn't anonymous. It came from the newly formed audit committee. Inside was an invitation. Not to another hearing. Not to a council. To a community cleanup. The note was brief. "We're repainting the playground fence this Saturday. Bring gloves. Bring peace." She almost laughed. But instead, she folded the note, placed it next to the blank violation form still on her table, and stared at both. One was control. The other, maybe forgiveness. By Saturday morning, she showed up. She brought gloves. She didn't speak much, but she stayed the whole time. No one made her lead. No one asked her opinion. She was just another set of hands. Mark noticed her, said nothing, just passed her a paintbrush and moved on. By the end of the day, the fence stood clean and white. As the sun set, Dylan stapled a new flyer to the neighborhood bulletin board. Neighborhood decisions are no longer made in silence. Karen stared at it for a long time, then looked up at the street once hers in every way that mattered. Now, it belonged to everyone. A week passed, then two. The days moved with the ease of late summer. Heat humming against driveways and breezes whispering through the trees lining Birchwood Lane. No new violations had been issued. The red Jeep came and went freely, sometimes replaced with other cars from the dealership, each one parked without fear, never hidden. The fear was gone. At the Harper house, Dylan packed a duffel bag into the Jeep's backseat. College orientation was a week away. Mark stood nearby, arms crossed, watching quietly. There was pride in his eyes, and something else, satisfaction, maybe. Not for winning, but for surviving a storm he never asked to weather. Dylan shut the trunk. Think she's really changed? Mark shrugged. Doesn't matter. The street did. Karen hadn't spoken to them again after the cleanup, but she'd been visible pulling weeds at the park entrance, helping an elderly neighbor install new shutters, even standing in line at the community coffee stand during Saturday mornings. Without asserting herself, she had faded into the background, not shunned, not exiled, just balanced. At the next audit committee meeting, her name came up only once. One resident mentioned she'd left a thank you note taped to the newly painted fence. No one mocked her. No one applauded. It just was. The formal vote to dissolve the previous HOA charter passed unanimously that evening. In its place, a community-managed association without a board president, rotating committees, and open vote requirements for all enforcement. Violations required not just evidence, but a public record of discussion and vote by majority. Power had been reframed, not erased, just redirected. 2 days before Dylan's departure, a delivery arrived at the Harper residence. A narrow box with no return address. Inside, a metal sign, professionally engraved. It read, "Authorized vehicle. Harper Auto Group Fleet." Attached was a short note. You never needed permission, but now no one can question it. There was no signature, but the handwriting was the same as the first anonymous note Karen had received. Only this time, there was no edge to the words, only acknowledgement. Dylan laughed and placed the sign in the garage. "Won't be needing that anymore," he said, "but I'll keep it." Mark nodded. "Frame it when you get to your dorm." A reminder. Of what? That silence is permission when you let it be. The day Dylan left, the Jeep rolled down Birchwood Lane slow and smooth. Neighbors waved. Some offered handshakes. Others gave brief nods of respect. Karen stood by her mailbox. She didn't wave, but she did meet his eyes, and this time, Dylan didn't look away. The Jeep turned the corner and disappeared into the quiet. Back at the house, Mark walked the front yard. A young couple across the street asked about the audit committee and how they could help with fall landscaping plans. He gave them a printed schedule, no instructions, just open slots they could choose from. That night, Mark took a chair to the edge of his driveway and watched the street grow dim. He didn't hold a clipboard. No papers. No phone. Karen passed by walking her dog. She stopped, hesitated, then said, "You staying out late again?" "Just making sure no one parks on the grass," he said dryly. She almost smiled. "Almost. I'll keep an eye on the hedges," she replied. They didn't need to say anything more. Birchwood Lane didn't go back to what it was. It became something else. Something quieter. More aware. less ruled by invisible lines and more by visible hands. And the empty driveway stayed empty for a while until a new Jeep pulled in one morning. A visitor. It didn't get a warning. It got a welcome.